Picture this: a dog is trapped inside a burning warehouse, flames crawling up the walls, smoke so thick you can barely see 3 feet in front of you, and this dog is scratching at a metal door that will not budge because someone locked it from the outside, and that someone was not a stranger, not some random criminal, it was the dog's own owner, a rich man who drove away in his luxury car while his dog burned alive inside. And if that does not make your blood boil right now, just wait, because what happens next involves a little stray pup with no home, no owner, and no reason to care, who runs miles through the city to find help, and the ending of this story will stay with you long after this video is over. Let me take you back to where this all began, because you need to understand exactly who this man was before you can fully grasp what he did. This was not some struggling guy who made a desperate choice, no. This was a wealthy businessman who owned multiple properties across the city, a man who wore suits that cost more than most people's rent, who drove cars that turned heads on every street, and who lived in a house so big that half the rooms sat empty because he had no one to share them with. He had bought the dog 3 years earlier, a beautiful golden retriever named Benny, and back then people thought he actually cared about the animal because he posted pictures online, showed it off at parties, treated it like an accessory that made him look more human than he actually was. But here is the thing about people who only love things for what they represent: the moment that thing becomes inconvenient, they throw it away like garbage. And that is exactly what happened with Benny. See, this man had decided to sell one of his warehouses on the outskirts of town, and the deal was going through quickly, faster than he expected, but there was one problem: the warehouse had been sitting unused for months, filled with old equipment, broken furniture, and apparently, his dog. He had started keeping Benny there about 6 months earlier because the dog had gotten older, slower, less impressive at those fancy parties, and this man did not want an aging pet ruining the image of his pristine home. So he dumped Benny in that warehouse like forgotten inventory, visiting maybe once a week to throw some food through the door, and that was the extent of his care. But now, with the sale going through and inspectors scheduled to come look at the property, he needed to deal with the dog situation. And instead of finding Benny a new home, instead of taking him to a shelter, instead of showing even a shred of basic human decency, he came up with a different plan altogether. That night, he drove out to the warehouse alone. The sun had already set, and the streets in that industrial part of town were completely empty: no witnesses, no cameras, no one to see what he was about to do. He walked inside, looked at Benny lying in the corner on a pile of old blankets, and the dog actually lifted his head with hope because he thought maybe, just maybe, his owner had come to take him home. But instead, this man poured accelerant across the floor, splashed it along the walls, soaked the wooden beams near the entrance, and then he walked back outside, locked that heavy metal door with a padlock from the outside, and lit a match. He did not hesitate, did not flinch, did not look back as the flames began to catch and spread, and he drove away in his expensive car while behind him, that warehouse started glowing orange against the night sky, and inside, Benny had just realized what was happening. The fire spread faster than anyone could have predicted, racing along the accelerant trails like it had a mind of its own, climbing up the walls, consuming everything in its path, and the heat became unbearable within minutes. Benny started barking, howling, throwing himself against that metal door over and over, but it would not move, it would not give, because it was locked from the outside with a padlock meant to keep intruders out, and now it was keeping a living creature in. The smoke filled his lungs with every breath, making it harder and harder to see, harder to think, harder to keep fighting, and Benny's barks turned into desperate cries that echoed through the empty industrial lot with no one around to hear them. His paws scraped against the concrete floor as he searched for another way out, circling the room in a panic, but every window was too high, every wall was solid, and the flames were getting closer by the second. This dog did not understand why this was happening, did not understand what he had done wrong, did not understand why the person who was supposed to protect him had left him here to die. But there was someone watching, and this is where everything changes. Across the lot, hidden behind a rusted dumpster, there was a little stray pup who had been living in this industrial area for weeks. This dog had no name, no collar, no home to go back to at night. She was small, maybe 30 pounds at most, with matted fur and ribs you could count if you looked closely enough. She survived on scraps from trash cans, on rainwater collected in old containers, on pure instinct and the will to keep going even when no one in this world cared whether she lived or died. She had seen the rich man's car pull up, had watched him walk inside and then back out, had seen him lock that door and light that match, and now she was watching flames pour out of the windows while that horrible sound, that crying, that desperate barking, filled the air. She did not know Benny, had never met him, had no connection to him at all, but something inside her understood exactly what was happening. Another dog was in there, trapped and terrified and dying, and she could not just sit there and watch. So she did the only thing she could do, she ran. Not away from the danger, but toward help that she somehow believed existed somewhere in this cold, indifferent city. She took off running down the empty street, her little legs moving as fast as they could carry her, and she headed toward the part of town where there were people, where there were lights, where someone might actually listen. She ran for half a mile before she reached the first house, and she scratched at the door, barking as loud as she could, but the person inside just yelled at her to go away and turned off the porch light. She kept running, another quarter mile, and she found a group of teenagers on a corner, and she circled them, barking, pulling at their shoelaces, trying desperately to communicate something her voice could not say, but they laughed and pushed her aside and kept walking. She ran to a convenience store and scratched at the glass door while the clerk inside just stared at her and shook his head before going back to his phone. Every single person she encountered looked at her and saw nothing but a stray, a nuisance, a dirty little dog that was not worth their time, and no one, not a single soul, stopped to wonder why this animal was so frantic, why she kept barking and running and looking back over her shoulder like she was begging them to follow. 2 miles she ran that night, through streets and alleys and parking lots, getting more exhausted with every step but refusing to stop, because every second that passed was another second that Benny was burning, and she could not let him die alone, she just could not. Her paws started bleeding from the rough pavement, her lungs burned almost as badly as that warehouse, but she kept going, kept searching, kept believing that somewhere in this city there was one person with enough kindness left in their heart to help. And then she found him. His name was Harold, and he was 72 years old, a retired factory worker who lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat. He had spent 40 years working with his hands, and now those hands were wrinkled and scarred, and his back hurt most mornings, and he did not have much money left after paying his bills each month. He was walking home from the corner store with a bag of groceries when he saw this little stray pup running straight toward him, barking like her life depended on it. Most people would have stepped aside, would have ignored her, would have kept walking without a second thought, but Harold was not most people. He stopped. He looked at her. He saw the panic in her eyes, the desperation in the way she circled him, the way she kept running a few feet forward and then looking back at him like she was saying, "Please, please, please follow me." Something told him to listen. He set his groceries down right there on the sidewalk, and he started following this little dog. She took off ahead of him, glancing back every few seconds to make sure he was still coming, and Harold moved as fast as his old legs could carry him. They covered block after block, Harold's lungs burning, his knees screaming at him to stop, but he did not stop because the look in that dog's eyes told him that something was terribly wrong and she needed him and he was not going to let her down. When they finally reached the industrial district and Harold saw the glow in the sky, his heart sank. When he got close enough to see the warehouse fully engulfed in flames, orange and red dancing against the black night, he almost stopped breathing. And then he heard it, faint, weak, but unmistakable, the sound of a dog crying from inside. Harold did not call for help first. He did not wait for someone else to handle it. He saw that padlock on the door, and he grabbed a piece of metal pipe from the ground, and he started swinging at that lock with everything he had. His shoulders screamed, his arms ached, but he kept swinging until that lock finally broke and he could pull that door open. A wall of heat and smoke hit him so hard he staggered backward, coughing, eyes watering, barely able to see, but he did not walk away. He pulled his jacket up over his nose and mouth, and he ran inside. The smoke was so thick that he was essentially blind, moving by sound alone, following the weak barking that guided him deeper into that burning building. Pieces of the ceiling were falling, flames were spreading across the floor, and Harold knew that every second he stayed in there brought him closer to dying himself, but he kept moving. He finally found Benny collapsed in a corner, barely conscious, fur singed, too weak to even lift his head. Harold grabbed that dog, all 70 pounds of him, and he lifted Benny onto his shoulders with strength he did not know he still had. He turned around and headed back toward the door, but the fire had spread behind him, blocking parts of his path, and he had to push through a wall of flame that burned his arms and his face and made him scream in pain. His jacket caught fire and he ripped it off with Benny still on his shoulders, and somehow, he made it out that door and collapsed onto the ground outside, both of them gasping, both of them alive. But Harold was hurt badly. His arms were covered in burns, his lungs were full of smoke, and he could barely move. He lay there on the ground, coughing, struggling to breathe, too weak to even call out for help. And that is when those two dogs did something that proved everything I believe about animals and their capacity for love. Benny, still weak and disoriented, crawled over to Harold and lay beside him, refusing to leave his side, pressing his body against Harold's like he was trying to protect the man who had just saved his life. And the little stray pup, the one who had run miles to find help, she did not rest either. She took off again, sprinting toward the main road, and when she saw a car approaching, she ran right into the middle of the street and would not move. The driver had to stop, had to get out, and when they did, this little dog grabbed their pant leg and pulled them toward the warehouse, barking the whole time, until they saw Harold lying on the ground and immediately called 911. When the emergency services arrived, they found Harold unconscious beside Benny, and they found the stray pup still circling them both, still barking, still refusing to abandon them. The paramedics rushed Harold to the hospital where he spent 3 days in intensive care being treated for severe burns and smoke inhalation. They said that if help had arrived even 5 minutes later, he probably would not have made it. They also said that if someone had not gone into that warehouse when they did, Benny would have been dead within minutes. And while Harold was recovering in that hospital bed, people started asking questions. How did this fire start? Why was that dog locked inside? Who owned that warehouse? And the answers they found made everyone sick. The police investigation revealed the accelerant, revealed the locked door, revealed the rich man's ownership of both the property and the dog. They found his car on traffic cameras leaving the area right before the fire started. They found the padlock he had purchased that same day. And when they brought him in for questioning, this man, this wealthy, powerful, supposedly respectable businessman, tried to lie his way out of it, tried to claim he had no idea what happened, tried to say that Benny must have run away weeks ago. But the evidence was overwhelming, and for the first time in his privileged life, money could not make his problems disappear. He was charged with arson, animal cruelty, and reckless endangerment. The story made local news, then national news, and suddenly everyone in the country knew exactly who this man was and what he had done. His business partners cut ties with him. His deals fell through. His reputation crumbled. And when he finally stood in that courtroom and heard the judge read his sentence, there was no army of lawyers who could save him from facing real consequences for the first time in his life. Justice, sometimes, still exists in this world. But the most beautiful part of this story is not the rich man's downfall, it is what came after. When Harold finally recovered and was released from the hospital, he went home to his small apartment above the laundromat, and waiting outside his door were 2 dogs. Benny, now healthy and healed, had been cared for by a local rescue group during Harold's recovery, and they had brought him here because everyone agreed that this dog belonged with the man who saved his life. And sitting right beside Benny was the little stray pup, who had apparently refused to leave the area near Harold's apartment ever since that night, like she was waiting for him to come home. Harold looked at those 2 dogs, and something in his chest broke open. He had been living alone for 5 years since his wife passed. He had been lonely in ways he did not even let himself acknowledge. And now, standing in front of him, were 2 souls who owed him their lives and who were offering him their love without any conditions, without any expectations, without any strings attached. He knelt down, and they both rushed to him, tails wagging, faces pressing against his chest, and Harold cried right there on the sidewalk with his arms wrapped around both of them. He adopted them both that same week. Benny finally found the home he deserved, with someone who would never see him as disposable, never lock him behind a door and walk away. And the little stray pup, who Harold named Hope, finally had a family after spending her whole life surviving on the streets alone. They sleep in his bed with him now. They eat meals beside him. They follow him on slow walks through the neighborhood where everyone knows their story and everyone stops to pet them and thank Harold for being one of the good ones. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Hope had given up that night. If she had stopped running after the first person ignored her, or the 5th, or the 10th. If she had decided that no one in this world was going to help and there was no point in trying. Benny would have died in that fire. Harold would have kept walking home with his groceries, never knowing that just a mile away, he could have been a hero. But Hope did not give up. A stray dog with nothing, no home, no family, no one looking out for her, ran until her paws bled because she refused to let another living being suffer alone. And somehow, in this massive city full of people, she found the one person whose heart was still open enough to listen. There are some humans who have everything and still choose cruelty. And there are some animals who have nothing and still choose love. That is not a lesson, that is just the truth, and this story proves it in a way that I do not think anyone who hears it will ever forget. I want you to think about that for a second. A man with more money than he could spend in a lifetime looked at a living creature that trusted him and decided that its life meant nothing. And a homeless dog who had never known kindness decided to risk everything for a stranger. So tell me something, drop a comment right now and let me know, what do you think about a person who could do something like this to an innocent animal? And do you believe that a little stray dog with no home can still have more heart than some humans will ever have? Because I already know my answer, but I want to hear yours. And if this story hit you somewhere deep, if it reminded you that real kindness still exists even in a world that can feel so cruel sometimes, then please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with your friend who loves animals. Share it with the person who needs to be reminded that small acts of compassion can literally save lives. Because stories like this deserve to be told, and people like Harold deserve to be celebrated, and dogs like Benny and Hope deserve to be remembered. Sometimes the ones with the least give the most. And sometimes a little stray pup running through the streets at night can teach us more about love than 100 humans ever could.